Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Coach's Corner University podcast. I'm your host, Paul O'Need, and today I am joined by a friend of mine, Dylan Seeley, Doctor of Chiropractic. Dylan and I met a few weeks ago at a mastermind in Washington, DC, hit it off right away, and I could tell he was just someone I vibe with, and I think has a ton to offer the audience here at Coach's Corner University. So, Dylan, welcome to the podcast, man.
Pleasure to be on, man. I'm excited for it.
Yeah. So like I mentioned kind of before we started, the podcast is pretty much aimed at coaches, from coaches to coaches. And I think you as a clinician and a coach provide a really unique perspective. The people that I know who know you speak really highly of you. So I kind of want to open the floor a little bit, tell the audience a little bit about yourself, how you got to where you are, and what do you think makes you so special, man?
I don't know if I'm that special, but
that's what they all say.
I would say I've had kind of like an interesting journey to where I'm at, and that pretty much none of it was planned. Like usually people have a goal set of like where they want to be with their life, and I've just been winging it as I go.
That's honestly though, I'm going to stop you because it's so common. Every person I've spoken to who's like, we'll say top in their field, they're like, I just went and did shit that I loved.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. Like, and it wasn't even, none of it's on purpose. Like the one thing that I actually wanted to do, someone was like, no, I'm not going to like let you stay here and do that. And it was Cav. It was coach like Justin Kavanaugh.
Yeah.
So I interned for Cav as a teenager because I was like, I have no direction in my life. Like I was a pretty good baseball player coming out of high school.
Okay.
But I just had such, bad problems with authority and staying out of trouble that I kind of pissed away a lot of those opportunities. And from there I was like, well, I don't really know what I want to, do. So, I went to like junior college to essentially try and play baseball. And by the time I got there, and I was like, I don't know if I really want to play baseball anymore. Like it doesn't excite me. So I came back home and then I had to figure out, what am I going to do with my life? And I was always interested in training athletes on the workout side of things because I got an exercise physiology textbook as a Christmas present, like which is the lamest fucking gift you can think of when you're like 17, but it was something I really wanted.
Listen, that gift probably changed your life, man.
Oh yeah. And that just kind of sent me down the rabbit hole of like working out. So I got into it really deep. I got into like the Poliquin stuff when I was like 17. So I hit that rabbit hole fairly quick. And then just kind of branched off and I was like, well, I want to just train athletes. So when I came back home after a semester, I'm like, I don't really know what I'm going to do. I'm just going to, shoot off a bunch of, resumes over to some training companies that are in the area. And I got a call back from Cav about it. And the worst part was he called me at like 6 o'clock at night and I was just about to hit the gym and I took the original like jacked formula, which like if anybody knows, yeah. So imagine having an interview with that on that. And I'm just
it's
like
basically legal meth.
Yeah. And so I'm like on another fucking planet while he's trying to have a conversation with me. And it's literally just like, yep, good, yep, perfect. Like he's probably like, this guy's a fucking idiot, but I'm gonna bring him in anyway. And I showed up, interned with him for the day, and then I stuck around with him for probably I don't know how long it's been now, almost like going on 12 years now. I've been with him, like on and off.
You still consult for Cav, right?
Yeah, like I still like help him out with stuff. He helps me out with a whole bunch of stuff. So now it's kind of less of me like mooching off of him and more of me actually being able to, kind of have a symbiotic relationship with him.
Love that.
So it's been super cool. So yeah, I did that. I got into the athletes training side of things. And then I was playing rugby as well during that time, like while interning for him. Got a scholarship to Wheeling University, or it was Wheeling Jesuit at the time, and played there. We had a fairly good team. And then going into my last, well, that's when I first started to rack up injuries. We'll kind of start off with that.
Yeah.
I had an avulsion fracture. So I tore my hamstring off the bone, which then nicked a piece of the bone off with it.
From your pelvis?
Yeah.
From your pelvis? Oh.
Yeah. So I got a nice little dent and I didn't even realize it at the time, like when it happened. So I just took like 5 days off and then just went back to training like normal. And my leg was always kind of stiff.
Sounds about right.
And then from there, we got into training camp, and our old strength conditioning coach was like former Green Beret. So everything was just like, we're going to run you into the ground, like as efficiently as possible. And I ended up with a stress fracture in my femur. And then I got upper respiratory like infections like all throughout training camp because we were just so overtrained. And the nutrition we had for the school was like dog shit. Because I found out that the school was like hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. So they bought the cheapest meal plan. So there was like no nutrition in any of that food we were getting. Like you would just feel more sick if you ate. So a lot of us would just skip eating meals and we would try and like find something at the grocery store that was like, that wouldn't perish in our dorm room.
So that like was tuna and microwave Uncle Ben's.
Pretty much. That's what I lived off of like for, a couple of years in school. So yeah, that was an absolute nightmare. Played with a stress fracture in my femur until it kind of calmed down, like, which it really did. And I played with it for like 2 months. And I was like, what's the worst thing that can happen? They're like, well, it can break. And I'm like, well, we'll cross that road when we get there. Luckily it never broke, but following year dislocated my shoulder, and it got to the point where it was just so loose we'd go for a jog and it would like pop right back out. Yeah, it was a pretty gnarly one. But the reason I started to rack up some of these injuries is because like of the, not necessarily the overtraining, it was just I was underfeeding. Like when I came into school, like I was a little meathead and like I had enough. I mean, I kind of equate it to having like body armor. Like that's the whole reason we lift, to play. Yeah, it makes you a better athlete, but it keeps you healthier in the long run. And when I got to school, I think I dropped like 20 pounds.
Oh my God.
So, I mean, just taking contact after contact just kind of beats the shit out of you. So I ended up getting a shoulder surgery. Surgery was like completely, I asked for one thing, the surgeon gave me something, we agreed on it. And then after I woke up from surgery, he told me he did something completely different to it.
Dude, the same thing happened to me.
Oh, it was a nightmare. So first practice back, not even first practice back, I was doing tricep pushdowns. My shoulder shot right out the back.
Out the back?
Everything. Yeah. During a tricep pushdown. Like, I'm like, what the fuck?
Did he put it in there with like duct tape?
Yeah, well, they didn't. I asked for anchors. I'm like, the moment I hit somebody, this thing's going to pop right back out. And they're like, no, you should be okay. And of course, like when you go to the university setting, like you're not necessarily getting like the best rehab unless you're at like a big time school. Right. And I wasn't. So it was like, you kind of get what you get. And that just caused a whole host of issues. Like I still have it to this day. I have like nerve damage on the back of my shoulder. So it's like, if I try and like touch, like I don't have, my tricep is not nearly as prominent on my left compared to my right. Like, and if I touch like this part of my shoulder, like I can't really feel it.
Great.
Yeah. Well, I also got the issue of having like thoracic outlet syndrome because how my shoulder set like this after the surgery, because I had me in the sling for so long, that the scalene's hypertrophied here. So it essentially like pinches off like on the brachial plexus. Yeah. Oh. So anytime I do like dumbbell incline curls after like a second set, like my hand just completely loses feeling. So it's kind of handicapped like where I'm at lifting wise. So some of these things you can still train around it. But
we're an inclusive podcast. We prefer the term handicapable. So
so I got I played there and I was like, I'm pretty much done. Like I don't want to play anymore after all this shit. So I took some time off. My buddy who we both played at the same time, later became like a grad assistant. He was a coach. Okay. And he had played at a higher level than I ever had. He played like professionally in South Africa, like in Australia, all this stuff. Wow. And then he's originally from like Australia. So then once he popped an Achilles and he was like, well, my career's pretty much over. I'm just going to come to the US and just play college ball, which like all the, internationals kind of do when they realize they can't play at the pro level anymore.
Right.
So we kind of had like a heart to heart. He kind of talked me through a lot of that stuff and then convinced me to come back and play for like one last year. I'm like, all right, I'll do that. And then I got the itch. I'm like, I'm actually enjoying it again. It's fun. I'm not hurting as much because I didn't have like my goal was always to have something in place. Like I wanted to be an All-American or I wanted to get to the next thing or to the next thing. The problem is like all my goals were extrinsically motivated. Mm-hmm. So what happens when I hit that next goal? I go, oh, shit, I got nothing to look forward to again. And then I had to reset. So it wasn't me necessarily chasing something inside of me. It was just, well, I got to do the next thing. I got to do the next thing. Well, now when I realize I'm never probably going to get to that next thing, all the motivation goes away.
Yeah, what do you do? It's a dark hole. Yeah.
So then I switched over to more of like an intrinsically motivated mindset and everything just became so much better. And then from there, I got a scholarship to chiropractic school for rugby, like ironically enough. But right before, I'd never been to a chiropractor in my life, right? So I had no idea what I was really getting into.
Really? Then why chiropractic school?
Just because I wanted to go on and continue to do things. So there's where Cav comes in. Cav told me he wouldn't hire me back until I got a doctorate in something. So I said, oh shit, now I got to start looking at stuff. So I started looking at med school and then I was looking at, exercise science things and all this stuff. Then I'm like, you know what, I can do like physical therapy, because there's a university right next to the gym. They had a branch campus. So I'm like, perfect. I'm just going to go do that. Well, I didn't realize that when you apply to the physical therapy schools, you have to apply to an agency, which then sends off all your transcripts and everything else. So there's a middleman. So by the time my stuff hit the middleman and the middleman sent it off, the deadline had already passed.
Right.
So now I'm like, oh, I've got nothing like set up. And then I was playing in a rugby tournament, and there was a chiropractor there, and he's, you're good enough, we can get you a scholarship at the school. So went out there, had a practice session with them, and then they offered me on the spot. But yeah, never been to a chiropractor in my life. I was like, well, give it a go. Okay. So obviously just winging it as we go.
Yep.
Yeah, and then from there, but I want to say a month before I went in, I got cheap shotted in the game, so I cracked a couple ribs.
Okay.
And I ended up fracturing. I got a spondy, so I ended up fracturing like my low back.
Oh, geez.
And I didn't realize it until I was doing reverse hypers the next day, and then I felt a big crack.
Oh yeah, that'll do it.
So then I was like, well, this feels odd. I'm just going to go do some hamstring curls. I got on one of the hamstring curls where it's like the prone one, but the hips are popped up a little bit.
Yep.
And I laid on it, and it must have caused enough separation into what was going on that I was like, I couldn't feel my legs. I was paralyzed. I had to have my buddy like drag me off of the thing. Just to get up scary. Off of it. But I didn't want to lose my scholarship, so I didn't tell anybody. And I tried playing through it for about 2 years, and it got to the point where it was so bad that I was like, we would do fitness tests, and I would just get such a low back pump because it was so unstable that I would pretty much like lose all feeling of my legs to the point where I couldn't even lift up my leg anymore. Like my hip flexors were just gone. I was in such a spasm that I would just fall flat on my face. And I would lay there for about 5 minutes, the pump would go away, and then I could go back to practice. Like, it was just crazy. And I remember, going to doctors and being like, I just need like, enough pain pills to make it through this weekend's game or this, that. So it got to the point where it was like, I was actively seeking out shit that was going to destroy me. And then when I couldn't get the pain pills, I'm like, well, I'll just drink until I can fall asleep and then kind of let it go away, which just dug me into this nasty hole. Because you just feel kind of like helpless. You got all these people and nothing's really helping you. And it's not until I found like Eric Serrano, and he kind of looked at my stuff and he was like, oh yeah, I can see the fracture there. And everybody had kind of missed it along the way. So then we started playing around with like, using peptides to kind of help heal that spot. And then I had to seek out a bunch of different people, like where I consulted with David Gray, who's now blown up. My claim to fame is I knew David when he only had like 2,000 Instagram followers. So now he's like a multimillionaire with a yacht probably. But no, Dave's the man. He's helped me out tremendously. But I had a consult with him for my low back, and he was rehabbing me. And at the end of the consult, he goes, anything else you want to ask? And I said, yeah, how do I become you? How do I get to be where you're at? And he said, here's all the people I've learned from. Here's the courses I've taken. Like, here's my thought process behind stuff. And I said, perfect. So literally as I got off that call, I paid for one of the courses that he had taken. So I started out with Gary Ward. And I learned all the things about the foot that I possibly could. And then from there, I signed up with Dave O'Sullivan, who's the head physiotherapist for England Rugby, and did a mentorship under him, learned as much as I could from him. And he is absolutely phenomenal how he incorporates all of his systems together. And then from there, I learned blood flow restriction training under Mario Novo. I did some dry needling stuff. Pretty much you name it, I've gone to try and learn it from somebody, because I realized that, nothing works every time, but something works every time. And it only takes that one thing to help that one person to make it all worth it. I might not agree with necessarily what the course instructor is teaching or how they say it, but if that thing works, it's worth, its weight in gold to that person that's been struggling their whole life.
Well, no one has all the answers, right? And
exactly.
It's one thing that, so I come from a sports performance background. So I was a collegiate strength coach for about 5 years until I transitioned out. Interned and learned from 20 or 30 people that I would call on a regular basis. We're talking head strength coaches at Penn State, I was at Robert Morris, I was at South Florida, I know coaches at Villanova, Georgetown, all these places. And to be able to, no one does the same thing. And I've always been of the mind that if no one does the same thing, there is no right way.
Exactly.
There is the appropriate way for, do the best you can with what you have where you're at. And you can only do that if you have a toolbox to pull from that has tools that fit in different spots. Because if all you have is a hammer
Exactly.
And,
And
and
sorry,
yeah,
not to cut you off, but
no, go ahead.
like that's such a prominent thing now within the realm of like physical therapy and chiropractic and everybody else. Like everyone's trying to be right, and they're willing to like shit on someone else's system, like even if it gets the result. And
And
that's it's the biggest push right now, where it's like we've learned so much about, I think I just made an Instagram post about this, but we learned so much about pain science that like we've kind of written off like other things along the way, like biomechanical aspects of pain or other things. And sometimes you can take a biomechanical approach and it actually fixes up someone's pain, right? But then if you talk to someone about that and they're like, well, no, it's all in the brain, it's not put in the brain, you got to talk to them this way, do this stuff. And it's like, sometimes it's just as simple as that. Like, yeah, incorporate the pain science aspect into things, but your patient doesn't give a shit about that. And I think the funniest thing I've ever had was I had a patient come in. She was getting seen by a lot of doctors at Ohio State University, because I live in Columbus, Ohio, right? And they're like the big medical system around here. And every person they saw, the big thing is like hurt doesn't equal harm. Like physical therapists, chiropractors, people who are really entrenched in the pain science love to say that hurt doesn't equal harm. Well, if everything you do hurts, you're not going to want to fucking do it, right? So I had the lady came up to me, and the first thing going through the intake, and the first thing she stops me and she says, "If you tell me hurt doesn't equal harm, I'm just going to walk the fuck out." And I go,
Good for
I
her.
completely understand where you're coming from, because I was told the same thing and it didn't do shit for me.
Yeah. I saw that post, and that post resonated with me a lot because, again, no one has all the answers. So if you look to pain science, cognitive behavioral therapy, and more of like a psychological approach, it's like, yeah, you can make a huge impact. But if you ignore the fact that this thing hurts and you just talk to them as if they're crazy, like, we're missing the boat. And you can do something wrong for so long. It doesn't matter how you talk to somebody. If you don't address that movement pattern with the biomechanics, you're not going to get any results.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's just such a gigantic frustration, because there's people who blend it really well, but like it's not, the pain science thing isn't sexy to talk about, and it's not something like, it's something we overcomplicate a lot of the time with people.
Agreed.
Like one of your fellow Canadians, Craig Lehman, like nails it when he talks about it's just like a bucket full of water. Like you keep adding these little stressors of water into the bucket, and eventually your bucket overflows, and now you notice the pain. But like biomechanics is one of those stressors that's in that bucket of water.
Oh, without question. And like, so when you look at your educational background leading to this point where you're able to, number one, communicate with this person in front of you and empathize with their situation because of your own experiences, but then have a bucket of tools to pull from where you don't have to use the same tools as those other doctors. You can do other things. Because I think it was Dr. Trevor Kashey who I had on the podcast in its previous iteration. And have you ever spoken to Trevor Kashey?
Mm-mm.
Do you know?
No.
Okay. So he is probably the biggest stickler for language I've ever met in my entire life. And he's like, I really don't like differentiating people between athletes and general population because everyone is a person.
Yeah.
And that kind of stuck with me in this context, because if you treat a person like an athlete or vice versa, you can actually set yourself apart in the way that this person feels that they're being communicated with. Because at the end of the day, performance is relative. Whether you're talking about a mother who is in so much pain she can't play with her son or her daughter, or you're talking to, Dak Prescott, who now can't take 3 steps back to throw a pass. That function relative to that individual is still performance. So being able to unlock whatever it is within that person's mind that's limiting their abilities. And like my mind is going a million miles an hour because you just hit on so many of the, the pain points. Because, I'm in the education field. And one thing I refuse to do is say that I'm right. Because there's no context in which I'm right all the time.
Exactly. And I mean, I taught at the university level too. And I got into like some of the stuff with my students, and it's like, I might use this approach. So I laid out programming I did for one of my guys, and I said, I might use this approach, and then the next year I might think it's garbage just because I've improved my knowledge.
Well, you should.
Yeah. I'm like, just because I think as we continue to go, we should be, striving to, continually improve. And what I look back on, I'm like, this is terrible. And then sometimes I look back at programs from like 8 years ago and I'm like, that's actually not that bad. I didn't know what I was doing, but it didn't suck. Like, it was honestly probably better than some of the ones I did 5 years ago.
Well, and what if it worked?
Yeah.
Right? Like, I've gotten a lot of people really strong doing things a certain way. Like, I used to be purely like West Side Conjugate. Then I transitioned into more like highly specific Eastern Bloc type programming. Now I have my own kind of spin on things. But at the end of the day, all of those systems got people stronger.
Yeah.
So is one better than the other?
The way that I describe it with people a lot of times is like all roads lead to Rome. It's just how many potholes are along the way.
I like that a lot. Yeah.
What's gonna break me down? Like, for some people, if they can tolerate a shit ton of, like volume and lifting, like, we might throw a West Side style like conjugate at them, or we might throw something else. If I've got someone who has minimal lifting experience, like we might throw in some, some lighter side of things, more gamification style stuff of just kind of like microdosing their lifts, get in and get out. So like, again, it's just kind of like fitting it to the person.
Yeah, I love that. So let's chat a little bit more about, your approach to rehab. And one thing that, you mentioned Greg Lehman talking about drops of water in a bucket, these stressors that build up over time. It seemed like, going through your injury history, we can draw a lot of parallels between that and that you showed up to school, you had a small, like we'll call it a smaller injury that led, then you overloaded your system with more work, less nutrition, school stress, had a bigger injury, and then it just seemed to add up. What is it about, your current approach that kind of feeds off of your experiences? And how do you have that conversation with a client, whether on the rehab side or the training side, about stress management? Like, how do you address that puzzle piece?
It's just getting them to recognize like what's going on, like and that's, kind of touching back on what I said in my talk at Cav's place. Like, the name of my clinic is like Inferno Performance and Rehab, because it's based off of Dante's Inferno. Like, Dante had Virgil to guide him to help recognize like all these ailments of society, and like that's essentially my job too, is to be like your Virgil in this rehab process, to kind of guide you along to recognize, things that might be hindering you, like getting in the way of like what's making you better. Like, I tell people, like, I don't make you better, like you make you better, right? I had a girl, she was she's at the Olympic Training Center for wrestling, like phenomenal wrestler, had a neck injury and went through 2 years of rehab with the Olympic training staff and was only getting worse, and they were like, we're going to operate on you. So she flew out here to see my father-in-law and I, and then we both worked on her, and within a week we got the pain and everything to go away, and she was back normal, right? And she's had this for 2 years. And she's thankful, saying like, oh, you fixed it. I'm like, I didn't fix anything. I literally just, sat on a medicine ball and ate a sandwich and told you what to do in the gym. Like, you were the one who was doing all the stuff. Like, I was just kind of hanging out, telling you what to do. Right. So I can't do the work for you. And, people get so caught up in that, where they think like someone else is going to fix them. Like, we're always looking for something else to fix the answer. And it's like, we can't do that if we don't look at ourselves first. And then we have to, take into account, like, we have to recognize like what's getting in our way. Is our sleep's like shitty, right? I'm not going to heal great if my sleep's shitty. Like, what's my blood sugar level, right? If diabetics heal poorly. So if you're eating like shit, don't expect to, be healing a herniated disc very quickly. If, again, like the sleep and then the blood sugar, nutrition side of things, like what's our stress at work? Like, what are the things that we can control and what are the things that we can't, right? And I lay it out as like, I tell people, like, I draw out a chart for them. So essentially, like, I put it in 3 spaces and we leave the middle blank. It's like, what do I not have control over? What do I have control over? And then in the middle, I have them write, what can I influence from the things that I don't have control over? If I can have influence over the thing that I don't control over, ultimately I have control over it, because I can influence it. I can influence the decision. So sometimes people come to me and they're like, they got this roadblock in their head. Well, it's like, well, I can't, fix this. I can't deal with this. And I'm like, well, you actually have an influence on it. It's up to you whether you want to act upon it. And once we start to reframe that mindset, I think it helps them tremendously. Just
you're a chiropractor. You're supposed to crack people. You're supposed to touch them.
Yeah, that's the other funny thing I get too is I have so many people come to me and they don't know that I'm a chiropractor. Like I think I've had people refer to me as like their psychologist. I've had people refer to me as like
I get that one a lot.
their physical therapist or their pain doctor. And I'm like, nah, dude, I'm just the chiropractor. But I can do all the cool shit. But yeah, so it's just kind of funny. Like you wear everyone's hat, so you're kind of a jack of all trades, and people don't really know how to label you.
That's a really okay. So I've had a lot of really interesting conversations about locus of control because it's one thing that, listen, it's really easy to admit fault when something's outside your control. Like just using nutrition as an example. If I believe that nutrition is complicated and I can't get the results that I want, whether it's, let's just say weight loss, if I can't lose weight, well, it's because nutrition's complicated. It's not because I failed at something. But then in the same breath, when people have successes, they're like, this person got me that. So they externalize their failures, but they also externalize their successes. It takes a lot to be able to unlock in the person that internal locus of control to say, hey, I can influence these factors that I thought were outside my control. But then what you're also doing in this breath by saying like, hey, I didn't do anything, you did the work, is you're trying to establish within them that internal locus of control over their successes. So they build evidence and now their self-efficacy goes up. And then when their self-efficacy goes up, now we have this, compounding effect on their results over time. That takes a lot of buy-in. So if that's also a lot of work. And it's a lot of work that doesn't necessarily have a direct ROI in the moment. Like if someone comes to see you, thought process would be, I need to make this person feel better today so that they come back and continue the process, that little win. How do you go about getting the buy-in from the person in front of you when what you're really, similar to some of the business talks that we talked about, it's like you want to offer results, you want to offer this solution, but when the solution's within the person and contingent on their effort, that's a tough sell.
Yeah, I tell people like I literally just had a talk with a patient about this the other day. So she more than likely like needs a shoulder surgery, right?
Yeah.
But she's in her 50s, like she's got some hormonal issues, she's got a whole bunch of shit going on, and she doesn't want the shoulder surgery. So I'm literally her last stop. She's seen like a handful of like some of the best physical therapists in like Columbus. She's seen some high level, orthos. Everyone's kind of telling her the same thing, and apparently I'm the guy that can prevent what's going on.
She's fine. If you're the guy, she's fine.
So we had a talk the other day because I've seen her like twice now. And when she first came to see me, like the moment she started to lift her arm, like she winced in pain, right? But her biggest goal was, she goes, I want to be able to like unhook my bra and not have like sharp shooting shoulder pain. That was it. That's like one of her big things. And I said, okay, like we just reversed engineer the process. Right. So like, how do I get, what are the motions that go into making this up? Right. So then
you bought her front clipping bras and sent her on her way.
That's what it is. And you just spin it around.
Yeah.
So we get into this process. What I told her, I'm like, the things I really care about are like, I don't want you to become hyper focused on your pain, but I want to know like what's the duration, what's the frequency, what's the intensity, day-to-day stuff. I'm like, and then I want you to journal it. And the reason like I want you to journal your pain and like your journey is because I want you, like we get so caught up on the process, and it's or not on the process, on the outcome, and it's binary. It's yes or no. Did it happen or did it not happen? And if it didn't happen, then you view it as a failure. But like nobody views the process like as a path to getting that outcome. They're only just focused on that outcome. And if you only ever focus on the outcome, you're always going to be frustrated until you hit that outcome. And it might be weeks, it might be months until you hit that outcome. So I said, hey, I just want you to journal it, and I want you to take note of like what's it like, because you might have had 2 shitty days in a row before you came to see me and be like, oh, it sucks, I'm not getting any better. But if you had 5 good days leading up to those 2 shitty days, like that's a really good sign. And then she was like, oh yeah, like, and she was like, that makes sense. And then she lifts up her arms. I'm like, well, did that hurt when you just agreed with me? She's like, no, why? And I'm like, you just lifted your arms higher than what you did last time and had no pain doing it. Meanwhile, when you first came in here and you tried to lift your arms more than 2 inches, you had a sharp shooting pain. She goes, oh yeah, I guess that's right. And the key is just taking those small wins. I listened to, I was at Allie Gilbert's Silverback Summit, and they had a Navy SEAL that was talking, and he was essentially breaking down. He was on a ruck, and he was just feeling like absolutely defeated because people were getting so far ahead of him. People were starting to catch up to him. He was absolutely exhausted because he was so focused on the outcome of reaching like the end of the ruck. And he goes, I just reframed my mindset. I said, all I have to do is just put one foot in front of the other. That's it. That's my next goal, just to put one foot in front of the next. And he goes, I just did that over and over and over. I just kept my head down and looked at my feet. And he said, eventually I just started passing people, right? Because he got fixated on the process and no longer on the outcome. And the outcome, was achieved so much faster.
I like that. What about, okay, so that, I like that because you've essentially reframed the wins away from something objective, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not binary if you feel better.
Right.
But creating that awareness through journaling or even through like tracking can have a profound effect. I mean, we see that all the time with progressions in training. Like that's one of the things that I switched recently. Like I used to be super old school. We're talking Excel spreadsheet. Here's your program. We're going to talk in WhatsApp about it.
Yeah.
But I don't need to see your data because I don't care. Then I started having clients more accurately track and tracking that I could see. And simply by doing that, progressions were faster. Progressions were more linear as opposed to undulating. And not only that, their buy-in increased. And it was just through a change in awareness. Can you speak a little bit to like, everything you're saying to me is counter to what you would think traditional physical therapy or chiropractic is. Like
pretty much, yeah.
Dude, that's not how chiropractors approach problems. The 90% of people, the reason I sent that message in the group the other day is because one of my clients went to go see a chiro and they tried to sell him on 30 sessions. He's like, fuck that. I don't need 30 sessions. My shoulder hurts. How do you address that? I mean, that's got to be a huge barrier for you.
I think the thing for me is like setting the expectation ahead of time. Like, what is the timeline for this injury? And I lay out like the natural history. Like, so for instance, like I had one of my fighters, like got injured like in his day-to-day job, and had to get a shoulder surgery done. Right. So like, what is the expectation on coming back from this surgery? Right. His expectation is I want to be back fighting in the cage. Right. His next, the next thing is what's the natural history of this injury? Well, he had like a clavicular osteotomy. So you're looking at about 8 to 12 weeks, like for a full, like, back to normal. And then you can kind of start working out again and getting back into the heat of things. Right. Yep. He was fighting at week 8. Like we essentially smashed that timeline because we set these little things in place and he was completely healed up. He went to the ortho at like 3.5 weeks out from the surgery and they got cleared to go back to work. Right. So for me, it's like having the expectation of what's going on. And then my goal is always to beat the natural history. And then I'm going to use the techniques and the technology that I have to make sure that we beat that. But it's also like holding people accountable, like within that thing. And I go not so much. So that's the other tricky thing with like the chiropractic side of things. With tracking the objective markers is very insurance based. So that's why it becomes such a heavy fixation. And since I'm not, I can be a little bit more personable with
you have like purely private practice.
Yeah.
Good for you.
But the other thing is like sometimes people try and sell you the packages. And I just had a talk with my old boss about this yesterday because that's how they had theirs structured. Mm-hmm. And I said, I've kind of moved away from that. And I've just moved into here's how many sessions you can get like for the month. And I just tier it. Like you can have, this many, or this many. Like, and it just goes into like that overall fee.
Right.
And it's more so like, I don't want to say, if it's, I think 30 sessions is a bit ridiculous. Most people like selling 10s. But when you get into this, it's like, if you didn't get that result within those 10 visits, like that person's going to be pissed off. So I kind of reframed it into like a monthly like thing. And the goal is like, I tell people like, yeah, like we're setting it for the monthly, but if you do all your shit, I don't have to see you that frequently. If you don't want to pay me a bunch of money, do all the shit that I tell you to do, and you're going to get better a hell of a lot faster. And then you don't have to spend money.
Fuck, man. I'm so glad you said that because I literally had this conversation with a great friend of mine. She's one of my business mentees. she runs a purely hybrid practice now. So she'll see people periodically in person, but all of her stuff is online. And the one that her selling point is, I'm going to hold you accountable outside of my office, so you don't have to come into my office. It's going to be cheaper in the long run for us to do it this way, and you'll get more access to me. And the thing is, people are getting better results than they would if they were seeing her in person, because now they don't have to see, they don't have the, the responsibility to see her in person, because she places that responsibility outside. And then add into that, right? If they're doing the work, they see the results of their hard work, that internal locus of control. Now they're, that self-efficacy comes up. Like, so the business model feeds the results the same way the actual intervention does.
Exactly. Like, and I think that's such a, like, I screwed up initially, like when I started to run the hybrid stuff, because in my head, if like someone tells me to do something to get better, like, I'm going to do it. I'm not going to question. Like,
Yeah,
I'm
you're
just
not
going to do
normal
what
though. I'm the same.
I'm going to
the
do
same
whatever.
way.
Yeah. I'm going to do whatever I have to do to get better. Right. So I sold somebody on this like thing. I'm like, hey, like you run a company, like you're getting on upon your busy season. You don't have time to come see me. I'm going to give you all the shit you can do at home. You just do it. And they're like, okay, yeah, I'll do it to get better. And then like, I wasn't great about like following up with them, because in my mind, like at that time, I'm like, everybody functions like me. Like they're just going to do the stuff to get better. And then I get a text message like from him like 3 weeks later. And he was like, hey man, like I haven't been doing any of this stuff. I just wanted to let you know. And I'm like, well, what the fuck? Like you said, you wanted to get better. And that's when I started to realize like not everybody like functions like me. Right. And then we get to the coach Cat, or not to the coach, to Cavs mastermind. And we start going over like in our little small group breakouts, like, yeah, you actually have to keep people accountable. Right. And that was just such a big mind shift for me. So that's why I've started to like stay on top of that a little bit more. But even when I break down my, like after my first deployment, I say, hey, we have 2 routes we can go. You can either go in person or you can go hybrid. Like if we go hybrid, like you have to do everything like on your own, and you need to make sure that you're doing it. I'll check up on you. But if you feel like you're not 1,000% committed that you're going to do everything I tell you to do at home, don't waste it. Like don't buy it, because I don't care about the money. Like I care about you getting better. Like nothing pisses me off more than like me taking your money and you not getting the result.
The accountability piece is something that whenever I have a coach come to me looking to, honestly, a lot of people come to me to restructure their business models, because most online coaches suck at business. And the number one barrier to online coaching, whether it be rehab, training, nutrition, whatever, is adherence, because you're not necessarily front of mind as the coach. They don't, unless you do something within your business model to be on their shoulder all the time, or at least give the perception that you're on their shoulder all the time, they're not going to do what you want them to do. And there's a few ways you can do that. Like the number one way is pricing. Like if you make it expensive enough that it hurts, they're going to do it. But in order to make it expensive enough that it hurts, you have to be able to prove you can get them results and have them trust you in that process. So one thing we did with Danny is we raised her prices. And I have no problem saying it on here. Her and I have talked about it. Because of the conversion rate from USD to CAD, I pay Danny almost $900 a month. But I value being pain-free and training because it's really important to me. And I know Danny can get me results. So I have no problem paying that money.
And I think that's the thing that I've kind of realized now is like when I first got started out, it's like you're trying to take everybody because you're broke. Like you need to get paid, you need a paycheck. So I was taking in all these people, and it was like, great because I'm getting paid, but I was also valuing myself so low because I'm like, if I'm not that expensive, people will come to see me. And like I would say I was a little bit more expensive than most, but I'm probably not worth what I was charging.
No, I would agree with that. Yes.
So like now that I've like I just continue to keep upping like my pricing structure, and I've actually been getting like more and more people, and I'm also getting like the right people, like the people that
you're getting higher quality people.
Yeah.
And then,
which is great. So I can actually focus on the shit that I care about and not have to be like counting them 24/7.
Yep. And not only that, like the quality of your service can go up because you don't need to work with as many people to be able to pay your bills.
Right.
And and as that quality of service comes up, then it feeds forward into the business model and everything you're able to do. And I mean, I don't want to get into that too much, but I think it's a good lesson for any of the coaches listening, that to some extent your price does position you in a way to attract the actual people that you want to be working with. And I think one of the things that that we talked about in the business mastermind is, the balance that has to be struck, because one of the big things that you want to be able to do within your practice is offer care to people who can't necessarily afford it.
Right.
But if you were charging those people who could afford it enough, you could subsidize your rates for those people who couldn't.
Yeah.
And I think that was kind of the unlocking thing. So I love that. I love that we were able to get into that. So coming back to the rehab, getting that buy-in, what would you say has been the most impactful thing for you in your evolution as a clinician?
To getting the buy-in?
No, just in general, to getting the results.
To getting the results, I would say one, a mix of that buy-in. So I kind of run like a 3D system. Like when someone first comes in, like I de-escalate the situation, because you're coming in to see me. You don't what's going on, but you don't really know what's going on because you've never met me in person usually, like for the first time. Right. So they're kind of nervous. They're like, I don't know what I'm getting into. I'm going to pay this money, hope this person can fix me. I don't know what they're like. So my whole goal is to de-escalate the situation. Like ask them closed-ended questions that they know the answer to. Right. Because now I'm starting to get into one, it's jogging their memory. So it's prepping them for the history that I'm about to take. So they're already knowing the answers to the questions, which builds their self-confidence. Right. So it's a little bit of a psychological tactic. Right. And then I might joke around with them, talk a little shit. How I am on this is how I am with everybody I work with. I'm pretty candid. From there, I get the details. So that's where we go into the history of stuff. And I really dive deep into what's going on. I want to know your sleep. I want to know about your period. I want to know about literally everything. Tell me anything and everything, because it's only going to give me a better, idea of what's going on, which gets you a better result.
Right.
And then the last is decipher. So I need to take all the details that you gave me, decipher what's going on, and then tell it back to you in a story form and how it's all connected, based upon the table tests, your history, subjective, objective measures, and then, cultivate the story and then tell it back to you. That's how I get buy-in. And people are like, okay, I like you within the first appointment. I've had people. So when I worked in an insurance model for this other company, we would get referrals from other doctors in town, and we would people would be pissed off that they got sent to us. They'd be like, I don't want to see you. And these people would be like, fuck it, I'm not paying. I don't want to be here. And they would literally tell our front desk staff this, right? They were pissed off that they had to come here. And they would leave they would leave with me, and they would come to the front desk staff, all smiles, and then book out some appointments, because I'm just so good at cracking people and just being a little shithead. Right. And getting people to like me, no matter how much of a dickhead I am, we can just find a common ground to bond, because you're talking to a real person. And I think that's missed with so many clinicians, is the over professionalist. And I'm the same degenerate in the clinic as I am in real life. You get
people real people.
Yeah. And I think that's the biggest thing. But then from there, the techniques and everything that I've used, I've learned so many different systems, and all the principles are kind of the same. They overlap. Yeah. So you don't need to know all 10 million different methods. It's just know the principles, because I can look at somebody, I'd say this person's going to respond to more of a PRI based approach, for their hip. And this other person's going to respond to an anatomy and motion, just based upon, foot structure, bone structure, whatever is going on. So it's helpful to learn all the systems, so that way you can kind of pick and choose. But then you'll also just find the underlying principles, and then from there you can just kind of create your own system. And I've broken things down into my rehab process. It just entails fatigue, speed, and load, just those three things. So I look at something and I go, okay, what's the fatigability of it? Initially, this might be a good thing to train, because it's not, too hardcore. Obviously, the load, so these are literally the three things that get you injured. When you're fatigued, you get caught in shitty positions, right? Which, biomechanically, it's inefficient. You're going to expose yourself to an injury risk. The faster you do something, the more force you're also putting through your joints, right? So there's less room for error. And then the heavier you go, no one gets hurt on a 20 rep max with 15 reps in reserve. But if I do a 1 RM all out and I get folded, I'm getting fucked up, right? So fatigue, speed, and load is how I program things. And I kind of use it as like a vertical integration. We train all of these qualities at once. Right. It's just what's my emphasis at this time. And people are like, that makes no sense, because when you go to like physical therapy school or chiropractic or whatever, like in rehab process, you learn like we do our fatigue stuff first, and then we kind of work into like high rep stuff, and then we get into a little bit heavier, and then we get into like plyo stuff, and then we get into like speed work. And it's like, well, if you just did all the shit at once and just a graded exposure from like a smart standpoint, like you don't have to then segmentalize it and then wait 8 weeks or 12 weeks to get better. When I just trained all the qualities at once, now we're back in half the time. That's why I've been able to cut down like my rehab times with people like so drastically. And we always beat the natural history, is because we're training all qualities at once. So that way I don't have to take an individual block of however many weeks to train this back up so they can get back on the field.
How do you balance, and this is something that I've been really wanting to ask, because you're clearly a tough motherfucker. To play rugby with a fractured femur, you have to be a little crazy.
Oh, yeah.
How do you balance that with also relating to that person in pain?
I mean, I've been there. I've been on both sides of the spectrum of being batshit crazy and just running through a wall. And I also understand how much it sucks to be in pain and dig yourself into a deep hole. So I think like since I've lived that experience, people can kind of relate a little bit better within that. But at the same time, my ability to feel sorry for you is not going to be necessarily like the same as like, a peer. Like I'm going to be hard on you, but I also give a shit because I've been there. But since I've been there, I can also be a little bit harder on you. All right. So I think that's where people are, and again, it comes back to like the buy-in, but they kind of understand that. And sometimes I'll tell the stories about myself of like, oh yeah, I went through, like I have this. And they're like, oh, and you're like, fine. And I'm like, relatively, not all in the head, but like, yeah, I'm okay. And I think that helps like a bunch with people. And I think a lot of times we just baby people, like in the rehab process. Like someone's like, oh, like I had someone in the other day. They had a basketball player had a Jones fracture. They put a pin through his foot, to heal it. And it's been 8 weeks, and he's out of the boot now. And I'm like, well, what's it like? Do you get pain, or what are you feeling? And he's like, I just feel a lot of pressure when I stand. And I'm like, okay, is it painful? He's like, it's just like pressure. I'm like, okay, stand your left foot, because that's his one where he has the pin in. And I'm like, you feel the pressure? He's like, yeah, I feel a lot of it. I'm like, all right, stand on your right foot. What do you feel? Pressure. I'm like, so they feel the fucking same as what you're telling me. And he was like, oh yeah, I guess so. I'm like, so is pressure pain? He's like, no. I'm like, well, why the fuck are you worried about it then? You're stressing me out just stressing about it. So it's like, it's really just getting through to people and understanding like their terms and their language too. Yeah. And I think that's a big thing. Like communication isn't about what you say, it's about what they hear. So if you're telling me one thing and I'm assuming something different, like, it's going to be all fucked up. And I actually found a perfect meme for that to throw into my lectures now, because there was like a couple sitting by the fire, and the fire's starting to go low, and the husband looks at the wife and he's like, can you put another log on that so it doesn't go out? And the woman just takes a shit on the fire, like just dropping a log on it. So like, make sure you're using the right verbiage. Everyone's on the same page with what we're saying.
Yeah, I found for me, it's something that I initially struggled with quite a bit as a younger coach, because I was like, the first time I squatted 800 pounds, I couldn't walk downstairs, but I squatted 800 pounds.
Yeah, that's what's more important.
To be in pain, to me, didn't matter.
And that's the conversation I have with so many people. Like I've talked to other therapists, and someone comes in, they're like, well, yeah, they only hurt if they bench 225. I'm like, well, how bad's the pain? They're like, oh, it's 1 out of 2. I'm like, fuck it, dude, I'll take that all day long. I'd rather be in pain and still hit my numbers rather than feel 100% and not lift shit. And I think that's where people connect with me really well, because I've played through all the injuries. And I had an honest conversation with somebody, like I would say 95, probably 99% of people would not have cleared this kid to play in a football game, because his ankle, he came into me like could not walk. And his coach called me Wednesday. I got him in on Thursday, and they had to play on Friday. This kid like could not walk. And they were like worried he might have had like a fracture or like some torn ligaments in the ankle. And I did like my little, chiropractic, like witch doctor voodoo magic on him, got him to where he could jog. I said, FaceTime me tomorrow morning. I want you to run sprints. Tell me how it feels. He says, I feel good. And I said, okay, tape it up. It's going to hurt like a motherfucker. You're not going to like, I mean, the worst thing that can happen is you just break your shit. That's it. Right. And even then, like, this is a playoff game. If you lose, you're out of the season anyway. So what difference does it make? Right. 99% of people would have been like, no, don't let him play because he could do more damage. I look at it as like, you're going to go into your off season anyways. And I'm just going to fix what's broken if it's broken. Like, it's really that simple. Like, I can build you back up, no problem. Like, but you need to get recruited. You need that scholarship. And I had another kid who was a baseball player. He was going into a showcase camp. His shoulder was hurting him. We did some stuff to rehab him back. I mean, the kid throws, 93, 94. So he's pumping some heat, but he wants the scholarship. And we did some, I'm like, here's the little rehab warm up you're going to go through to throw. Like, you need to do it right before you get out and you take your reps, like, because they have like 6 throws that they have to do from the outfield. And I said, I want you taking like 3-4 Advil before you go out there. So you numb it up a little bit and you don't feel shit. Right. We'll deal with it afterwards. You're going to be sore as hell tomorrow. That's okay. You come in on Monday and I'll fix it up. And sure enough, he went out there, balled out, was a little sore on Sunday, but he got a scholarship offer out of it. And I think that's where people aren't willing to push those boundaries, because at the same time, like, if shit goes wrong, like, you're in some deep shit. But I've also played at those levels and I've played through those injuries to know, like, it's okay to play through this. It's just going to hurt versus like, this will end your career. And there's times where I pulled people out and I go, this one will.
I was just going to say, so, I wanted to bridge the conversation towards, let's flip the script and say, you're going to get an athlete like me who will literally put his head through a wall to the point where, like, that's the reason I hired Danny, is because I couldn't do what I wanted to do anymore. How do you bring it back? Like, you're working with UFC fighters, right? Like, that's the definition of a high level UFC fighter, is that person who will literally rip their body apart. How do you kind of find that balance?
For those, it's a bit of a calculated risk. Like, what is like the overall, like, if I go and I say, you're not going to, like, I know we're not going to win, that's when we pull back. Right. Or I know if I hit this lift, I'm pretty much done competing for the next 8 months. And I go, are you willing to take the next 8 months off of lifting? If you just reframe it into that mindset, they're gonna be like, fuck no, I don't want to do that. Right. So if you put it into the terms of their sport, rather than be like, well, this is really going to fuck you up and you might need surgery. Right. Who cares? I'll go get the surgery. If I break a world record, I'll live with that all day long. All right. But if I say, hey, you're not going to lift, for the next 12 months, you're like, no, that sucks. I don't want to do that. So it's more so framing it into like their sport, speaking their language, rather than, saying, oh, you're just gonna be banged up and you're not gonna be able to do whatever you want to do for a while. Like, speaking to them like a doctor would, because there's no connection there. They've never been through like what you've been through, or they don't compete at the level that you compete at. So what do they know about that sport? And I think that's also a big frustration. Is like, you go to these sports med doctors and it's like, they don't know about your sport.
Yeah.
Right. Like, oh, your shoulder hurts when you throw a baseball. Oh, let's look at your shoulder. Maybe it's the fact that your left hip is like fucked and it has no internal rotation. So you're just opening up your front side and just cranking through the front of your shoulder. Right. But that's not what they're trained for.
No. Well, and I mean, that brings it back full circle to the beginning of our conversations. Like, if all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail, right? If all you have is a scalpel, you're just going to want to cut into stuff. And so I think what sets, it's been a common theme throughout our conversation of, are you able to think in parallel, find those common threads between the different approaches, integrate them into a system that works for you, and then have the ability to speak to people in a way they understand what you're saying, internalize it, and can ultimately make their own decisions to put themselves in the best position possible.
Yeah, for sure.
I love that. Okay, we're going to finish up with some quick hit questions that have nothing to do with what we just talked about.
Perfect.
Maybe one of them does. I like to get a bit ridiculous on this podcast. What is the most ridiculous thing that you have ever advised an athlete to do?
That I've ever advised an athlete to do?
My Instacart just got delivered to my neighbor. As I'm like watching out my window, the Instacart just got delivered to my neighbor.
Whatever I've told an athlete to do. Supplement protocols that are, let's say, like big boy supplements, that are highly frowned upon, that most doctors will never touch upon, like, and how to actually, take them for a said injury and how to do them right. I think that's very taboo, like with a lot of people. They'll be like, oh, don't touch it, just stay away from it. I'm like, well, this would actually speed up your injury, like the healing process, if you take it right.
Right.
So I've advised some people to take some
in
short
non-tested events. We're not cheating.
Untested events. Ironically enough, I feel like everything's technically like untested now. There's a guy who was fighting in the PFL, and he was fighting another guy that was just fucking roided out of his mind. And when the guys came backstage to get tested, like, they pulled the guy that I worked with and not the guy who was on steroids. Like, there's an obvious difference of like, one dude's just like walking around like Vitor Belfort back in the day, and then like my guy who's got some size, but he's not looking like that.
That's so funny. I mean, yeah, politics definitely come into play. Like, listen, I always have this conversation around CrossFit, because back in the day, we're like, Rich Froning's on steroids. I was like, do you think if he tested positive, that CrossFit would tell anybody that their poster child was on steroids?
No way, man. Not a chance.
Not a fucking chance.
Down at Westside.
They picked the Canadian chick from Calgary who finished 7th, and they popped her.
Yeah, like they always pull someone who's like not going to be on the card anyway, like with fighters. And what's funny is, like, if you go through like the USADA list at the time and look who's pop positive, it'd be like all of your favorite fighters. But the thing you don't realize, though, is that they only fight 2 to 3 times a year. So if your suspension is 3 months, it's not affecting your fight camp or even the next fight that you're going to take. Like, so if you get off-season tested and you pop positive, like, what's the big deal?
You just make your
off-season. You're not going to get let go by the
take
promotion.
More. What is one album you could listen to with no skips?
Wyatt Flores' new album. I think it's Life Lessons. I've honestly been listening to it every day, like on repeat, for probably the last, like, I think he came out with it maybe 3 weeks ago. And I think
what kind of music is it?
It's like, I guess it's country music, but it's not like my dog ran away, my wife left me type of thing. Like, it's more of like like Tyler Childers, like old school Tyler Childers, and like Sturgill Simpson. It's more of like that kind of vibe.
I dig it.
So I'm a big fan of his.
Do you crack an egg on the side of a pan or on the corner of something?
No, I do it on the stove. Like, I'll hit it on the countertop.
Surface.
Yeah, I'll hit it on a flat surface and then just puncture my thumb and then separate it.
Good man.
Kind of a psychopath about that.
Last question of the podcast. If there's one person that you could see on this podcast, but the caveat is you have to help me get them on, who would it be?
Oh, shit, there's a couple good ones. Selfishly, I'm going to say this one person because I love listening to him talk. But sometimes it's like, I think it's going to be hard to get him. Actually, I don't think it'll be too hard. He might be open to it. I actually talked about him in my seminar, or in the talk at Coach Cap's thing. Evan Pycon, just because he is an absolute genius. The way that he approaches everything is just so methodical. Especially from like the training, even like the lifting side of things, like getting into how he structures his programming and his auto regulation is like beyond fascinating. But then you get into his devices, like his wearable tech, like the Nox and all that stuff. You get into some really cool stuff, looking at, nitric oxide and oxygen saturation, desaturation levels within the blood and the muscles. It's super cool how to like kind of inform from the training.
So I'll have to do my research before.
Yeah, dude, it's he's, put it this way. I had a conversation with him like probably over COVID when I was like really diving into. So I learned Joel Jamieson stuff for conditioning for fighters and went through that. And then I went through Evan's stuff after that because I just went down this rabbit hole of conditioning and I came across Evan. And pretty much it was like, take everything you know and realize that you don't know anything. Like, none of it's actually true. And then you start diving deep into his concepts and you're like, holy shit. And it got to the point where I had a call with him and I was too afraid to ask a question because I was like, this is going to sound so stupid. It's probably the simplest thing in the world to him, but like, it's probably like, the most complex of the world thing, like for me. And I was so
Mhm.
afraid to ask him the question. And it's one of those where like people like, I don't know if you ever had someone like ask you a question, you kind of like pause and you're like, because it's kind of a dumb question, but I'll answer it anyway.
All the time.
Dude, he hit me like with one of those, and I was like, fuck, I knew it was a dumb question. But he was just so nice about it. But like just such a smart guy, fascinating mind. And his book is phenomenal. I highly recommend people pick it up.
Is he the guy who made it okay for you to program 8 hours of cardio for somebody?
No, I think the most I talked with somebody else and I said that I think the most they ever put someone out was like 6. But I've read like some endurance books like Skiba's work and a few others, and they've got some crazy ones. Guys are hitting like 14, 16 hours a week of like high,
Like
like
fighters are?
not fighters, but these are like, I mean, it's like true like endurance based athletes, but there's sometimes they're like a mix of them. No, I think the most I put a fighter on, I think was like that 8 that we talked about, but that was because it was like concussion protocol and a whole host of other things.
That's so fascinating. When you said that, I was just like, I put my pen down and I was like, really?
It's honestly not as bad as people think. Like you can just hop on a bike and just do a nice, but I mean, you're not crushing yourself. It's not like if you want to go for 5 zone system, it's not like zone 4, like 3, 4, or 5. You're literally just chilling out like zone 1 and zone 2. Like your heart rate might be 105 and you're just walking or riding the bike for an hour and a half. And you do that like 5 times. And I can't do math to save my life, but I'm going to round that off and say it's 8 hours a week or something like that.
That's ridiculous. I'm doing like 200 minutes of cardio right now, and I'm like, ugh.
Yeah, but it's funny though, like because I've got some guys where we put them through a workout, and they come in, they're like, "This is the hardest thing like I've ever done," like, and they're just completely shot. And then you have like my guys who have been doing just like we haven't even touched this one style of training. We've just been doing a whole bunch of other different forms of like lower level cardio, and then we get into the high level stuff and they smash it, right? And the guys are like, "What the hell?" And I'm like, honestly, if you just build the base up, like your life becomes so much easier. I had a guy, he had a fight, but he was going to get married because his wife was probably butchering it. I think they were from Hong Kong.
Mm.
So he flew out there and I was like, all I want you to do, I was like, you have 6 hours a week of literally just jogging, biking, or swimming. That's it. Your heart rate's not to go above like 125. And he did that and came back and we put him through the same workout that he like almost threw up in before he left and absolutely smoked it. And he was like, I could do like 5 more rounds of this.
That's something that I try to like hammer home with, especially with lifters. It's like, listen, man, if you're gonna get tired after a set of 5, how much training volume do you think you're going to be able to accumulate?
Exactly.
None. So if we do a little bit of cardio, again, zone 1 or 2, a good amount of steps per day, and a little bit of zone 2, your strength is going to go through the roof. Your ability to adapt is going to go through the roof. Your ability to assimilate nutrients is going to go through the roof. It's just such a low hanging fruit that people completely ignore because of specificity.
Yeah. And what's crazy is like your body doesn't give a shit about the specificity.
Nope.
Like in regards to literally anything, like macronutrients, like the food that you get it from. I mean, you can get into like some of the minor details of it, but like, a steak versus a hamburger, it's still like, protein's still the same in there. Like your
Mhm.
body doesn't give a shit about the specificity, but yet for some reason we take it to training, like it's got to be the most specific thing in the world. And it's like your body doesn't really respond to that. And that's also what Evan Pycon like helped me realize too. I was like, should all of our conditioning come from just hitting the heavy bag and doing some things like that? Because then it doesn't translate if we do a bunch of airdyne intervals and then go into the cage and they still gas out. And he's like, at the end of the day, like the car engine's still a car engine, like fuel is still the fuel. Like you need to look at the other factors, like what's his tactical approach, what's going on psychologically that might be inhibiting his performance or whatever. I'm like, oh, that actually makes a lot of sense.
One of my favorite things to do is actually like just go in the basement because we have a home gym. I have an airdyne and I'll set up like a couple kettlebells, a landmine, and I'll do like 2 minutes very easy on the airdyne. And then I'll go swing my kettlebell around, hop back on the airdyne for a couple minutes, go do some landmine stuff. It doesn't matter what you're doing as long as your heart rate stays in the point that it's supposed to be at for the prescribed amount of time. And then you can just walk away and be fine with it.
Yeah. And that's like the other thing too, is like when you get into some of the occlusion like stuff, like as long as the flow is super easy, I think it's at like there's a research paper like published on this actually, and I think it was like if you go above maybe like 70 or yeah, I think it's like 75% of a 1 RM, like you get a decoupling like of heart rate like from like
Yes.
what it would be in regards to cardio. So as long as you stay like below that threshold, like you can do your, you know, your kettlebell circuits or whatever else, or whatever lift that you want to do. As long as you stay within that, like you'll get the adaptation.
I feel like we could talk for hours, but dude, I really appreciated this, and it's been a pleasure getting to know you and hearing more about, like, you know, just how your mind works. And I really hope that this next year you start to put out some more information and spread your message out to the people.
Yeah, that's the goal. Kind of hop on a few more stages, talk some shit to people,
Love
be as
it.
sarcastic as possible.
Love it. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Please make sure to like, share, subscribe, and support the podcast with the sponsors in the description. Dylan, thank you for joining, and look forward to chatting more with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, man. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.